The headlines are loud because they need to be. They always are when the story underneath is quiet. You've seen the footage already. Emergency summits, urgent statements, grainy satellite images, leaders framed against flags, maps with arrows, commentators speaking with absolute certainty about motives and consequences. The visuals suggest immediacy, personality, drama. They suggest that something sudden has happened, that a decision was made, a line was crossed, a response was triggered. But that framing is a convenience, not an explanation. What you're being shown is not the event. It's the wrapper. The real story does not sit in press conferences or televised addresses. It doesn't live in the moral language of right and wrong, escalation and restraint, strength and weakness. Those are narrative tools, not analytical ones. They exist to keep attention focused on people because people are easy to follow. Systems are not. This is not a story about leaders making choices in isolation. It's not a story about ideology or values colliding. And it's not a story about a single year, a single vote, or a single crisis. It's a story about constraints finally becoming visible. To understand what's unfolding, you have to step away from the spectacle and look at the architecture underneath it. The incentives that accumulated quietly, the trade-offs that were deferred for decades, the material limits that don't respond to speeches or sanctions or symbolism. Because what looks like escalation is often exposure. And what looks like aggression is often arithmetic catching up. The media will tell you this is about security, or sovereignty, or deterrence, or credibility. Those words sound substantial, but they're placeholders, abstractions used when the real drivers are too structural, too technical, or too uncomfortable to say out loud. So, let's set the spectacle aside. Let's talk about systems. This was never a moment. It was a process. One of the most persistent illusions in modern geopolitics is the idea of suddenness. A war breaks out. A crisis erupts. A relationship collapses. In reality, very few global events are abrupt. Most are slow-motion outcomes that only look sudden because the early stages were boring, technical, or politically inconvenient to explain. What you're watching now, the standoffs, the disruptions, the retaliatory language, is the final phase of a process that has been unfolding for decades. A process shaped not by emotion, but by systems that were stretched past their design limits and held there by policy choices that assumed tomorrow would look like yesterday. For years, the dominant assumption was that the global economic order was stable enough to absorb almost anything. Supply chains could be rerouted. Energy could be substituted. Capital could be frozen or released as needed. Currency systems would remain trusted. Infrastructure would quietly hold. That assumption is no longer holding. What's changed is not ideology. What's changed is capacity. When systems are underutilized, politics feels flexible. When they are tight, politics becomes rigid. Choices narrow. Leverage concentrates. And actions that once seemed unthinkable start to look inevitable. This is why framing the current situation as a moral contest misses the point. Morality implies choice. Systems under constraint often remove it. The question is no longer what leaders want. It's what the system will allow. Incentives, not intentions. To understand any large-scale geopolitical move, you have to separate intention from incentive. Intentions are what leaders say they want. Incentives are what the system rewards or punishes regardless of what anyone wants. For most of the post-Cold War era, incentives aligned in a way that made cooperation cheaper than confrontation. Global trade expanded. Energy was abundant. Credit was inexpensive. Currency risk felt abstract. The cost of disruption outweighed the benefits. That alignment has been eroding. Not because of bad actors or failed diplomacy, but because the underlying conditions that supported it are changing simultaneously and in the same direction. Energy systems tightened. Debt loads increased. Supply chains optimized for efficiency lost redundancy. Demographics shifted. Currency systems became more politicized. Each change on its own was manageable. Together, they formed a pressure gradient that could only be held by constant intervention. Sanctions here. Liquidity injections there. Temporary agreements. Strategic reserves tapped. Emergency exemptions issued. These measures didn't resolve the pressures. They redistributed them over time, assuming that growth, innovation, normalization would eventually rebalance the system. That rebalancing hasn't arrived. So now the system is doing what systems do when stretched too far for too long. It's forcing a reset, unevenly, and without regard for narrative comfort. The long build-up and one wanted to watch to see how inevitable this was. You have to zoom out far beyond the current news cycle. Start with trade. Over the last 30 years, global trade became more concentrated, not more diversified. Production clustered where costs were lowest. Processing clustered where capital was deepest. Transportation routes optimized for speed, not resilience. This worked until it didn't. When disruptions began appearing, financial crises, pandemics, regional conflicts, the response was not to rebuild redundancy, but to patch vulnerabilities with policy. Subsidies replaced slack. Strategic reserves replaced surplus. Financial instruments replaced physical buffers. At the same time, sanctions became a preferred tool of statecraft. They were attractive because they appeared precise and nonviolent. Freeze assets. Restrict access. Isolate financially. The assumption was that modern economies could not function outside the dominant financial plumbing. But every sanction also carried an unintended lesson that dependence is a risk and alternatives are worth building even if they are less efficient. So parallel systems emerged quietly. Alternative payment channels. Shadow logistics networks. Bilateral trade agreements bypassing global hubs. Local currency settlements. Non-traditional insurance and shipping arrangements. None of these replaced the dominant system overnight. They didn't need to. They only needed to exist well enough to function under stress. Meanwhile, infrastructure aged. Ports expanded unevenly. Refineries aged without replacement. Power grids were patched, not rebuilt. Transport corridors absorbed more volume without proportional investment. This decay wasn't dramatic. It didn't trend on social media. But it mattered because infrastructure determines what is physically possible, not what is politically desirable. Layer on demographics. Populations aged in industrial economies. Workforces shrank. Consumption patterns shifted. Public finances became more strained. The capacity to absorb shocks, fiscal, social, political, declined. None of this triggered immediate collapse, but it narrowed margins everywhere. By the time the current crisis reached the surface, the system had very little flexibility left. Why pressure turned into action? From the outside, it can look like escalation driven by impatience or aggression. From inside the system, it looks different. It looks like deadlines. When energy markets tighten, you don't feel it immediately. You feel it months later, when maintenance is delayed, when inventories don't rebuild, when insurance costs spike, when credit terms change. When currency trust erodes, you don't see panic. You see quiet diversification. A few percentage points here. A bilateral agreement there. Over time, those small shifts compound. When supply chains become fragile, you don't see collapse. You see prioritization. Certain routes matter more. Certain choke points become non-negotiable. Eventually, the system reaches a point where inaction carries more risk than action. That's the phase we're in now. Not because leaders suddenly became reckless, but because the room for delay closed. This is the part of the story the headlines can't tell you, because it doesn't fit into a segment or a slogan. There was a window, long and gradual, where different choices could have widened margins again. More investment, more redundancy, less financial weaponization, slower optimization, shared burden. That window closed quietly. What remains is management of consequences. Why this is a system story, calling this a political crisis implies it can be solved politically. Calling it a security crisis implies it can be deterred. Calling it a moral crisis implies it can be corrected through norms. But systems don't respond to rhetoric. They respond to inputs and constraints. Energy systems respond to geology and infrastructure. Financial systems respond to trust and liquidity. Trade systems respond to throughput and bottlenecks. When those systems are misaligned, No amount of messaging can realign them quickly. That's why actions that look contradictory at the surface often make sense underneath. Negotiation alongside escalation. Cooperation alongside coercion. Public statements that don't match private behavior. It's not confusion. It's adaptation under constraint. And this is where the real story begins to diverge sharply from the spectacle. Because once you see the system, the personalities fade. The moral drama recedes. What's left is a map of incentives that explains why this moment arrived now, and why the outcomes ahead are likely to be far more complex and longer-lasting than the headlines suggest. Where we are going next in the next part, we'll move from build-up to bottleneck. We'll examine the hidden material constraint that turned long-standing pressure into immediate urgency, a constraint that rarely appears in mainstream coverage because it's technical, unglamorous, and deeply revealing. It's the kind of detail that doesn't belong in a press conference. But once you see it, the entire sequence snaps into focus. And when it does, the world starts to look very different. Not darker, not simpler, but more intelligible. That understanding is where stability eventually comes from. Not from spectacle. From clarity. The bottleneck NO1 talks about, if you want to understand why pressure suddenly turned into action, you have to look for the constraint that couldn't be negotiated away. Not the speeches. Not the alliances. Not the threats. The constraint that mattered wasn't ideological or military. It was material, embedded in infrastructure, finance, and time. And like most decisive constraints, it was invisible until it wasn't. The moment when flexibility disappears for a long time, the global system functioned on a simple assumption that if something became scarce or expensive, it could be substituted. Another supplier, another route, another contract, another financial workaround. That assumption held because margins were wide. When margins are wide, systems feel forgiving. Mistakes don't cascade. Delays don't compound. Political disagreements don't immediately translate into physical shortages. But when margins shrink, substitution stops working. The current phase of global tension didn't begin with confrontation. It began with a narrowing of options. Quietly, across multiple domains, the system lost slack. And nowhere was that loss more consequential than in energy. Not energy as a headline commodity, but energy as an industrial input shaped by decades of fixed investment. Not all energy is the same. One of the most persistent misunderstandings in public discourse is the idea that energy is interchangeable. Oil is oil. Gas is gas. Megawatts are megawatts. That's true at the level of abstraction, and dangerously false at the level where systems actually operate. Energy infrastructure is not generic. It is highly specialized, expensive, and slow to change. Refineries, pipelines, storage facilities, shipping fleets, and chemical plants are built to process very specific inputs in very specific ways. Change the input, and the system doesn't adapt. It breaks, or it runs inefficiently, or it shuts down. For decades, much of the world's industrial infrastructure was designed around a particular profile of energy inputs, not because it was optimal forever, but because it was abundant, reliable, and politically stable at the time. Those assumptions no longer hold. And retrofitting infrastructure is not a policy decision. It's a capital-intensive, multi-decade process constrained by labor, materials, permitting, and financing. You can announce a transition overnight. You cannot build one overnight. The refinery problem. This is where the bottleneck begins. A significant portion of global refining capacity, especially in older industrial economies, was built to process heavier, more complex crude blends. These refineries are sophisticated, expensive, and deeply integrated into regional economies. They cannot simply switch to lighter inputs without losing efficiency or shutting down units entirely. At the same time, much of the growth in oil production over the past decade has come from lighter crude sources. These are easier to extract, faster to bring online, and attractive to markets, but they are not a one-for-one replacement. The result is a structural mismatch. On paper, production looks sufficient. In practice, usable supply is tight. This mismatch doesn't show up in headlines. It shows up in margins, maintenance cycles, unplanned outages, and price volatility. And when geopolitical friction removes access to certain blends or routes, the mismatch becomes acute. Why reserves are not a solution. Strategic reserves are often presented as a safety net, a buffer against disruption. They are, but only temporarily. Reserves are designed to smooth short-term shocks, not to compensate for long-term structural imbalance. Once drawn down, they create a future obligation, replenishment. And replenishment happens under different conditions than withdrawal. When reserves are released, it's usually into a stressed market. When they are refilled, it's often into a tighter one. That creates a timing problem and a political one. The longer replenishment is delayed, the thinner the margin becomes. The thinner the margin, the higher the cost of any additional disruption. Eventually, reserves stop functioning as a buffer and start functioning as a signal that the system is operating closer to its limits than it appears. Energy is only half the constraint, the other half is financial, and this is where urgency replaces patience. Energy doesn't just move through pipelines and tankers. It moves through payment systems, insurance markets, clearing mechanisms, and currency settlement layers. For most of the modern era, those layers were invisible because they were trusted. Trust reduces friction. Friction increases cost. Cost shapes behavior. When trust erodes, friction returns. Currency as infrastructure. Currencies are often discussed as symbols of national strength. In reality, they function as infrastructure. They are the rails on which trade moves. A dominant currency offers convenience, deep liquidity, low transaction costs, predictable settlement, legal clarity. Using it is often easier than avoiding it, until avoiding it becomes necessary. Over time, the use of financial restrictions transformed currency infrastructure into a strategic lever. Access became conditional. Settlement became politicized. Compliance became a geopolitical variable. From a narrow perspective, this looked effective. From a systems perspective, it created a powerful incentive: build alternatives. Not immediately, not completely, but sufficiently. The quiet construction of parallel systems, alternative systems, didn't emerge because they were superior. They emerged because dependency had become a liability. These systems are not as efficient. They are not as liquid. They are not as seamless. But they are resilient under pressure. Bilateral settlement agreements, local currency trade, alternative clearing networks, non-traditional insurance pools, state-backed logistics. Each workaround reduced vulnerability slightly. Over time, those reductions compounded. The goal was never to replace the dominant system overnight. The goal was to ensure continuity if access was restricted. And once that continuity exists, leverage shifts. The real source of urgency. This is where the story changes pace. For years, the system absorbed pressure through adaptation. The costs were distributed, the inefficiencies tolerated. But recently, something changed. Multiple constraints aligned. Energy margins tightened. Financial fragmentation accelerated. Debt servicing costs rose. Demographic pressures intensified. Infrastructure aging became unavoidable. When these factors align, timing matters. Decisions that could once be deferred become urgent. Negotiations that once dragged on become time-bound. This is why the current moment feels compressed. Not because events are moving faster, but because the system no longer has room to wait. What this was really about from the outside, the event you're watching appears to be about security, influence, or deterrence. From inside the system, it's about control over future optionality. Who sets the terms under which energy is produced, processed, transported, and paid for? Who controls the rails of settlement? Who absorbs risk, and who exports it? These questions don't make for dramatic visuals, but they determine who can act and who must react. Spectacle versus balance. This is why the spectacle matters, not because it explains anything, but because it distracts. While attention is focused on movements and statements, the real activity happens elsewhere. Contract renegotiations, insurance repricing, shipping rerouting, currency hedging, infrastructure access agreements. These are not emotional decisions. They are risk calculations. And they're already happening. Why the outcome will not be clean. Systems under constraint rarely produce elegant outcomes. They produce partial solutions, unintended consequences, and long adjustment periods. Even if short-term objectives are achieved, access restored, flows stabilized, confidence projected, the structural incentives remain changed. Trust, once conditional, does not fully recover. Redundancy, once built, is not dismantled. Alternatives, once viable, are not abandoned. This is the quiet legacy of the moment you're watching. The view from elsewhere, perhaps the most important shift, is not how this is interpreted domestically, but how it is interpreted elsewhere. From the perspective of many states, the lesson is not about strength or weakness. It's about predictability. If access to critical systems can be restricted, then insulation becomes rational. If rules change under stress, then optionality becomes survival. This doesn't produce confrontation immediately. It produces diversification. And diversification changes the system slowly, then all at once. What comes next in the final part? We'll step away from causes and examine consequences. Not predictions framed as certainty, but paths shaped by structure. We'll look at what happens when a system tries to enforce stability through action instead of adaptation, and how that choice accelerates the very realignment it seeks to prevent. And we'll end not with alarm, but with something quieter: perspective. Because understanding systems doesn't make the world smaller. It makes it navigable. After the noise, every system reveals itself most clearly after the noise fades. Not in the hours after an announcement. Not during the surge of commentary. But in the weeks and months when attention moves on and decisions quietly compound. That is where we are now. The spectacle has done its job. It focused attention, signaled resolve, reassured some audiences, unsettled others. It created the impression of control, that something decisive had been done. But systems don't respond to decisiveness. They respond to alignment. And alignment is where the real consequences begin to emerge. What action can and cannot do? There is a comforting belief in modern politics that action equals solution. Intervene and the problem changes shape. Apply pressure and behavior adjusts. Demonstrate resolve and stability returns. Sometimes this works, especially when the system has slack. But when a system is already tight, action often accelerates the trends it is meant to stop. This isn't because action is wrong. It's because action interacts with incentives that don't disappear simply because attention has shifted. The measures taken in moments like this rarely fail outright. Instead, they succeed partially, and in doing so, they change the environment in ways that are not reversible. Flows resume, but with conditions. Access is restored, but with hedges. Trust is signaled, but not fully extended. And once behavior changes at the margin, it tends to stay changed. The three paths forward from here, there are only a few plausible trajectories. None of them are clean. None of them are dramatic in the way headlines prefer. They are structural paths, slow, uneven, and shaped by incentives rather than declarations. Path 1. Managed adaptation. In this scenario, the system absorbs the shock without fracturing. Energy flows stabilize through a mix of renegotiated contracts, infrastructure optimization, and temporary inefficiencies. Financial channels remain functional, though more conditional. Parallel systems exist, but they complement rather than replace the dominant ones. This path requires patience, coordination, and a willingness to accept lower efficiency in exchange for resilience. It is the least disruptive outcome and the hardest politically, because managed adaptation doesn't feel like victory. It feels like compromise, incrementalism, and sustained attention to details that rarely earn public credit. But when it works, it preserves optionality. Path 2. Gradual fragmentation. This is the most likely path, not because of failure, but because of momentum. In this scenario, systems continue to function, but less universally. Trade becomes more regional. Settlement becomes more diversified. Energy routes become more segmented. Standards diverge slowly. No single moment marks the break. Instead, the global system becomes a patchwork of overlapping arrangements, interoperable in calm conditions, brittle under stress. This fragmentation is not collapse. It is reconfiguration. And for many actors, it feels rational. Reduced exposure. Increased control. Fewer single points of failure. The cost is complexity, higher transaction costs, more redundancy, slower growth. But complexity is often tolerated when predictability feels uncertain. Path 3. Competitive insulation. In the third path, insulation becomes strategy. States and blocs invest heavily in self-sufficiency where possible and alignment where not. Payment systems harden. Supply chains shorten. Infrastructure investment accelerates, but along parallel tracks. This path does not eliminate interdependence. It redefines it. Access becomes negotiated case by case. Leverage is applied more frequently. Cooperation exists, but it is transactional and conditional. This path is stable in the short term and volatile in the long term. It reduces vulnerability, but increases the risk of miscalculation because fewer shared assumptions remain. Why none of these paths end the story? What all three paths share is this: none of them restore the world as it was. That world depended on a set of conditions that no longer exist. Abundant slack, cheap capital, universal trust in shared systems, infrastructure ahead of demand. Those conditions produced a long period of relative stability, not because conflict disappeared, but because it was buffered. The buffers are thinner now. This doesn't mean the future is worse. It means it is more explicit. Costs appear sooner. Trade-offs are visible. Choices carry consequences more quickly. In some ways, this is a return to normal, not the end of order, but the end of frictionless order. The misreading that matters most. The greatest risk is not conflict. It's misinterpretation. If actions taken under constraint are read as preference rather than necessity, responses will overshoot. If adaptation is read as weakness, pressure will escalate unnecessarily. If diversification is read as defiance, cooperation will narrow further. Systems fail not when pressure exists, but when feedback is misread. This is why narrative matters, not to justify but to understand. When the public conversation stays at the level of spectacle, it deprives decision-makers of space to adjust. Everything becomes symbolic. Every move must signal strength. Every compromise looks like retreat. Systems don't need strength. They need calibration. What stability looks like now, stability in the coming period will not look like harmony. It will look like fewer grand agreements, more technical ones, less universalism, more interoperability, lower peak efficiency, higher baseline resilience, slower growth, fewer shocks. This kind of stability is quieter. It doesn't trend. It doesn't reassure instantly, but it endures. And it creates space for something important: learning. The role of understanding systems doesn't give control. It gives orientation. When you understand that events are shaped by constraints, not just choices, the world becomes less chaotic. Not simpler, but legible. You stop asking why someone decided to act and start asking what options remained. You stop expecting clean endings and start recognizing transitions. This shift in perspective doesn't produce cynicism. It produces steadiness. Because steadiness comes from knowing where pressure points are and where they are not. The quiet source of hope in this context does not come from optimism. It comes from capacity. The same forces that fragment systems also force reinvestment. Infrastructure gets rebuilt when it can no longer be patched. Redundancy returns when efficiency proves fragile. Local capability grows when dependency feels risky. These adjustments are slow, uneven, and imperfect, but they are constructive. They anchor activity back in physical reality: ports, grids, factories, skills. And physical reality, unlike narrative, compounds in tangible ways. Belonging in a complex world. One of the hidden costs of spectacle-driven narratives is alienation. They make the world feel like a stage controlled by distant actors, with no role for understanding. Systems thinking does the opposite. It reminds us that outcomes are shaped by millions of small decisions: investments made, skills learned, infrastructure maintained, contracts honored. Belonging doesn't come from control. It comes from comprehension. When you see the system, you're no longer just reacting to headlines. You're situating them, placing them in context, scale, and time. That is a form of participation. The view ahead: the world is not ending. It is reorganizing. Not around a single center, not around a single rulebook, but around a more distributed set of capabilities and constraints. This will be messier. It will be slower. It will sometimes feel less reassuring, but it will also be more honest, less reliant on assumptions that no longer hold, more attentive to physical limits, more explicit about trade-offs. And that honesty over time creates a different kind of stability, one rooted not in illusion, but in alignment. After the helicopters leave. The cameras move on. The commentary resets. What remains are contracts, pipes, ports, ledgers, and systems quietly adjusting to a new balance. That is where the real story lives. And once you've seen it at that level, you don't need spectacle to feel oriented. You understand why events happen when they do. You recognize patterns instead of reacting to shocks. You see not just pressure, but pathways. That understanding doesn't make the future predictable. It makes it navigable. And in a world undergoing structural change, that is not a small thing. If you like this video, then subscribe our channel. Thank you.